seller commented, provided that to his potential buyer. The buyer went and inquired about insurance on the property and was quoted $14,000.
Yeah.
Now, her policy's $3,100.
Right.
And we found out later that it was assignable, so we got out of that.
Okay.
He didn't buy a house anyway, but.
That would be
but
enough to
there's-
dissuade me.
There's just a lot of very confusing scenarios with
Yeah.
which we sell.
Yeah.
If they assign it, does it then jump next year?
Could.
And they might give it to you this year, but after you close next year, they get you a balance.
But just like an existing,
What's that?
just like an existing homeowner had the cedar rates would be the same thing.
Right. And that, and the complexity of that, and the variability of that from policy to policy is another reason why it makes sense to do the study first, to figure out exactly what we're talking about place to place. Because the terrain, I think, is pretty variable, basically. Yeah. Yes.
My home was put in the floodplain this year on Newtown Creek.
Okay.
So that house hasn't flooded in 115 years.
Okay.
But when I did purchase it back in 2000, I did a survey and had a flood elevation study done. So the first policy that I was offered was like $3,900. And then with the elevation report, giving that to my insurance company, it went down to $1,200.
Okay.
So the elevation study is really important.
Yes. Yeah, and we've told residents to do that too, and in some cases, we actually had a meeting, I'm trying to think back now, it was probably 2 years ago at the time that FEMA was in the midst of their remapping process. And Mike Fitzpatrick and I hosted a meeting over in Lower Makefield at the library. And we had someone from FEMA there to talk about some of these issues. And one of the things that we suggested to homeowners was if you pool your resources and hire an engineer, it's cheaper. You can usually get a lower rate. And at the very least, if you're talking about a couple $100, it's probably a good investment to see if you can make that argument. Because they can always appeal to FEMA to try to get them out of it. I mean, once the maps are set, that's done now. But the individual homeowner can always file a request to have their particular determination re-examined. So that's something that they can do. Now, I don't know what the rate of success is on that. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. But excuse me.
I know two that have gotten it.
Two that have gotten it. Yeah. So it's certainly when you're advising clients, I would say it's certainly something that they should consider to the extent that they might be able to avoid the problem by doing it that way. But thanks for sharing that. Any other questions?
A different issue, but the school funding formula.
Yes.
You've talked about that. Could you just explain, a little bit about the proposal and where it is now?
So the proposal is unfortunately gotten caught up with the whole budget impasse. Typically, what we do with the school funding proposal, the school funding mechanism, is that gets passed as part of the school codes bill every year as part of the budget process. So any change would hopefully be part of the budget deal this year. There are a number of changes in the proposal to help really make the system be more equitable and focus more on districts that need the help, that don't have the tax base. And over time address the issue of the real inequitable piece of this, which is the hold harmless agreement, which basically says if you got X amount last year, you're entitled to X amount this year. We have some real problems right here in Bucks County with that. And one of them is a new part of my district, Morrisville Borough, which really is significantly underfunded by the state, partly because some of the other issues on economic data, but also because of the hold harmless. We have districts in this state that have, over the last 30 years, been losing huge numbers of students. The population shift has happened where the economy has shifted, the jobs aren't there anymore, people have left the community, and as a consequence, the school districts have shrunk incredibly. And yet, they're still being funded at a level as if they still had those larger populations, Whereas areas like ours that have grown in leaps and bounds in the last 30 years are not getting proportionately what they really ought to be getting. Right now, the average statewide is about 33% funding from the state, and yet many of our school districts get far below that. Council Rock, I believe, gets about 18 to 19% of state funding. Pennsbury, my other large district, gets about 22%. And I don't think anyone's arguing ultimately that there'd have to, some of the wealthier districts have to be exactly on par, but there has to be more fairness in the system. And that fairness ultimately will help us stabilize property taxes. We have this debate about property taxes, and we should, because there are a lot of people in our communities that really can't afford to continue to pay increasing property taxes, particularly older people, people on fixed incomes. There are lots of different ways to address that issue. One of them is ultimately by making sure that our schools are doing everything they can to keep costs at a reasonable level. But we also need for the state to put more funding into education, and then to make sure that funding is driven out in a more equitable way. And so that's what this proposal seeks to do by changing the various formulas as to the different factors that go into consideration of a school district, the demographics, the economic status of the district, those types of things, and then get to a point where we can phase out the hold harmless. There's no way we're ever going to get rid of the hold harmless like this, because there are just too many districts that benefit from it, and therefore too many legislators for whom it would be really political suicide to get rid of it. So that's not going to happen. The best we can hope to do is to phase it out over time.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
I have one more on 1299, sir. Who do you foresee as members of the task force?
We have it written out where there are different appointments from the legislature and the governor. There is a proposal, I'm trying to remember back now. We did have DCNR involved, but there was one other, forgetting at the moment, that I did speak to the governor's office, and they had some suggestions about others who should be included as well. So I want to make sure, obviously, that the task force has, is as broad representation as possible in order to be able to do the work and to do it effectively.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned DCNR, the canal. And earlier you spoke about how the flooding wasn't necessarily, or some of the damage to the homes wasn't necessarily a result of the river, but
Right.
the canal. So the canal in the upper part hasn't been filled in about, 10 years or so.
Right.
And there have continually been issues with it, things that come up that prevent it from being full. So I'm curious about how the state, because it is the state, DCNR is a state-run organization.
Right.
How they're analyzing rebuilding some of these areas along the canal so that they can, that flooding is prevented. Because
Right.
oftentimes they take into consideration the historical nature of these repairs, which are, certainly important,
Right.
but they're not really addressing the flood issue.
Right.
So, it's just this constant, revolving door. We're hoping for water, then we don't have it.
Right.
So,
Right.
and I don't wanna go off on a tangent with that, but you mentioned, down in Lower Bucks where they re-engineered and came up with a larger culvert and other options that has helped flooding down there. But
Right.
what about all along the canal? It's 60 miles long.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know what the status of that is. I haven't spoken to DCNR about that, but it is an important piece of it, because I do think that, it's a great resource, both, from a natural perspective, from a recreational perspective with the towpath and all the use that gets, and from a historic perspective. I think it's important. But the management of it needs to be holistic. We need to make sure that we're addressing the entire thing, and that whatever changes need to be made are being made in all those areas. And that includes not just projects like dredging and widening culverts where necessary, but also managing locks and water that's coming in as well. And that's been an issue in the past, particularly with these flood events where there has been at least a concern that flow in and out has not been managed as properly as it could have been to help mitigate some of those problems. So, but I will certainly look into that and see where we are with the other areas further north.
Yeah, I ask because if somebody from DCNR is gonna be on the task force, I would just think a lot of those things should be taken into
Yes. Yeah,
consideration.
I agree. Yes, Wayne back.
In reference to the last person's question, Friends of the Delaware Canal is a good organization. It's a volunteer organization.
Right.
That does a lot of work and policy and what have you, and really is in charge of the procedure. But it's something you ought to contact if you're curious about canal situations. The canal has had problems managing its response to heavy rains. And 2011, they had an idea that essentially they would leave the canal at full,
Right.
going into the storm, of epic proportions, and then see what would happen, because they were getting frustrated with the fact that they had to continually repair the tow paths from the walls, because the water would flow in, not from out of the canal, but into the canal from the Delaware River. And the erosion was significant and damaged the domes and walls and retaining walls and blocks and so on and so forth. It amounted to, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars worth of damage. So they left it full, and then it just flowed out all over people's properties and property damage. My property was affected. I had about $50,000 worth of damage that was not covered by the insurance policy because it's not structured to the house. It's damage to an outside structure, garden, and walls, ground, septic system, so on and so forth. So that is a major issue is how the DCNR manages. And they didn't take much responsibility for those errors in judgment.
Shocking.
I called them and I confronted them on it, and at first they were very apologetic, and then later on, I knew responsibility for some of it, so it's another way of looking at it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the Friends of the Delaware Canal. I mean, again, not to get too specific on the canal issue, because this flooding issue is true everywhere in many other places in the state, but they do a very good job. Back when
the Delaware Greenway, the Delaware Wild and Scenic Management Committee, and all of the local EACs, environmental advisory groups, all of these groups should be and do, this question I forgot to say, a work about not only the canal, but all of the various tributaries flowing into the Delaware to try to advance best practices when it comes to development, creating a more localized infiltration as opposed to the old
pass it down the street.
Send it to the next community.
Yeah, well, actually, our EAC in Lower Megfield played a pivotal role in actually, they did the first draft of the low impact development ordinance. So they were very involved in that, and that was really good. But yeah, and the topography, getting just specifically on the canal again, topography is different up and down the canal. For example, in Lower Megfield, south of Yardley Borough, the canal, you've got the canal, can I write on this?
Sure.
Run back to my school teacher. You got the canal here to the west, you've got the river here, and there's a little bit of a downswale here, and then there's kind of a hump. So you really don't get the river doing what you just described in that piece. You just get water coming down that then reaches the canal and floods these areas, and you get the river flooding here, and these lucky folks who are kind of looking at a cross section and kind of goes like this. And these folks don't get affected; they become an island essentially. But this is where the water is coming and it's breaching. Now in other places, it's pretty flat. And the canal may be much closer to the river. And so you do get the river flowing over and breaching the berm, as you said, in the canal and destroying it. And in both cases, when you have those significant events, the towpath goes away, and now you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars of restoration as well. So that management of the water, and this gets back, and I don't want to go too far afield here, but there is a serious problem with the reservoirs in upstate New York that are in the Delaware Valley watershed, because the voids that they keep on those reservoirs are far too small, so they cannot accommodate the amount of water that happens in these really significant rain events. And so the water has to go somewhere. It goes out and it goes into the local watershed and becomes a flooding problem downstream. That's a problem, you know, we've been trying to address now for 10 years, and the real issue, of course, is it is politically a battle with the city of New York, because those reservoirs, you know, provide water to New York, and New York, of course, never wants to be in a drought situation. As we've argued, you can keep those reservoirs at 80% capacity, which leaves you a 20% void, which is more than enough, according to most of the engineers, to accommodate those heavy stormwater events and not put the city of New York at any jeopardy of being in a drought or
So,
not having water.
Are you saying that's not happening now, or?
It's not, the voids are not sufficient right now to accommodate that water in those heavy
I think
stormwater
most
events.
of us believe that is happening.
It's not consistently happening. I mean, it varies from year to year, but it's not a consistent, what we'd like to see is a rule where you keep it at 80%. Don't let it, because when it goes up and it gets into the 90s, that's when it becomes a real problem. Yeah.
Part of the redrawing, FEMA's redrawing of the map was actually initiated by a study, a joint study done between Penn State and the National Oceanic Organization.
Right.
It was essentially initiated by a group here in Bucks County, the Bucks County Commissioner's Flood Task Force.
Mm-hmm.
I actually was on that, and we got the people from Penn State to come down and talk to us about the various models that they did. They had a very complex system of models that they developed to try to study the flow of the river,
Right.
and see what would happen with the various you know, levels of, there's three major reservoirs: the Pacton, Neversink, and I can't remember the other one, but anyway, those three reservoirs, and all of them, if they calculated in the 20% void, there was compelling evidence, but it wasn't 100% conclusive.
Right.
And so you couldn't get a complete consensus. Jersey is behind it, we're behind it. New York communities that are impacted by the Delaware flooding are behind it. But as you pointed out, New York City carries an inordinate amount of weight.
Right.
And so those are still not policy, and they should be.
They should be, yeah. And you know, listen, so there may not be 100% consensus, or there may not be, you know, that level of proof to say that it absolutely will prevent these events from happening. But if you know that the 80% is going to be sufficient to meet the water usage needs of New York City, why not at least try it, right? I mean, it seems to me that from a policy perspective, you have enough evidence to suggest that it is a major contributing factor.
Well, they did, actually.
Yeah,
There was an experiment done where they did keep the 20% void, and we did come into a hurricane, and I don't remember which one it was, and it did work.
Yeah, right.
But again,
Yeah.
the statisticians, there's two different schools of
Yeah,
thought, and
yeah.
they analyzed it from two different perspectives.
Yeah.
One said it did, one
the other
said it
said
had
it
no impact.
Yeah, it's hard to run the control group on that, right? Because there's a lot of other factors that are out there, but
That's huge.
yes.
On a federal level, I kind of remember the Tox Island Dam project that was, I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes.
And it was, the federal government came in and bought up a lot of property up in the Poconos and then totally abandoned the whole idea, which was a concerted effort, I think not just Pennsylvania, but it would have been, I think, New Jersey also.
Right.
Any hope of the federal government footing some of this bill on managing the Delaware River, at least the Delaware River?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I despair at the moment of the federal government coming through with anything. I mean, you know, as
It will be an
dysfunctional
election
as Harrisburg may be,
Yeah.
you know, that's precisely why we're talking about on this flood insurance issue of creating a state subsidy, because I don't think, frankly, we can count on the federal government to do the right thing in providing a greater share of that relief.
It just makes me wonder that if they had gone through with the project, would it have benefited all of us along the Delaware River
Yeah.
down below?
Yeah.
And I think it would have, and plus offer recreation and all other kinds of things.
Right. So,
Yeah. Rather than state level.
yeah, right.
Where they have the lump in the waterway, what would the cost to dredge that out be? Would it not in the end benefit?
I'm sorry, and maybe you
You
might.
got the hump in the waterway, okay?
Well, you can't,
Yeah.
no, this is not in the waterway, I'm
live there.
sorry.
Oh, it's not in the
These are,
waterway?
this is land,
Those are
so these are houses.
No.
So, and this is
Well,
why,
you
this-
just
You know what, Fred,
and so now you know why my students used to complain when I had to do something. That's the canal, that's the river, there you go.
The houses.
House. Don't say it looks like a factory, it's a house.
And what would the cost to remove those be?
We're past our allotted time, folks. Any final questions? One, two, maybe, that you have to have?
All right, well, thank you all very much.
Everybody, the representative's been a great friend to the realtors, and again, we want to thank you for coming out and supporting this, and we look forward to working with them statewide. Statewide, we're going to also push this for you as well, because it's very worthwhile. So thank you again for coming out.